The Sermon on the Mount, Key Teachings, Part 1. Imagine yourself sitting on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The air is crisp, the sun shines gently, and around you a crowd has gathered. The center of attention is Jesus of Nazareth. He has just uttered the Beatitudes, those revolutionary words that have captured everyone's attention. But he doesn't stop there. What follows is a teaching that will redefine the understanding of the law, morality, and the relationship with God. Welcome to our exploration of the key teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. In this video, we'll dive into the first part of this remarkable teaching, examining how Jesus deepens and radicalizes the understanding of the law. Before delving into the content of Jesus' teaching, it's crucial to understand the context in which he speaks. In Jesus' time, Jewish society was deeply shaped by the law of Moses. The Pharisees and scribes, considered the guardians and interpreters of the law, had developed an elaborate system of rules and traditions to guide daily life. This system, known as the oral tradition, was meant to be a fence around the law, protecting people from transgression by providing detailed rules for every aspect of life. For example, to respect the Sabbath commandment, they had defined exactly what constituted work, even specifying how many steps one could take on that day. However, this system had often led to rigid legalism, where external observance of the law was sometimes privileged at the expense of its deep spiritual meaning. Jesus often criticized this approach, accusing the Pharisees of straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel, Matthew 23:24, meaning they focused on minor details while neglecting the essentials. It's in this context that Jesus brings a teaching that both affirms the importance of the law and reveals its deep and radical meaning. He doesn't reject the law, but he interprets it in a way that emphasizes the divine intention behind each commandment. Jesus begins this section of his teaching with a powerful statement. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Matthew 5:17. This statement is crucial for understanding Jesus' approach. He doesn't reject the law of Moses, comes to give it its full meaning, to bring it to perfection. It's a bold declaration that positions Jesus not as a mere teacher, but as one who has the authority to interpret and fulfill the law. To understand the scope of this statement, we must remember that in Jewish tradition, the law was considered the very word of God. By stating that he comes to fulfill it, Jesus implicitly identifies himself with God. It's a claim that would have been shocking to many of his listeners. Jesus continues by saying, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Matthew 5:18. This insistence on the permanence of the law may seem to contradict some Christian interpretations that see Jesus coming as the end of the law. However, what Jesus affirms here is that the law, in its essence and divine intention, remains valid. What will change is how it is understood and lived out. In Jewish thought, the law wasn't simply a set of rules, but an expression of God's wisdom and will for human life. By fulfilling the law, Jesus doesn't abolish it, but reveals its deep meaning and brings it to its full expression. Jesus then launches a stunning challenge to his listeners. "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:20. Understand the impact of this statement. We must remember that the scribes and Pharisees were considered models of piety and religious observance. They dedicated their lives to the meticulous study and application of the law. For the average Israelite, their level of righteousness seemed unattainable. By demanding a righteousness that surpasses theirs, Jesus sets the bar incredibly high. But what is this greater righteousness? The examples that follow will clarify. It's a righteousness that isn't content with external observance of the law, penetrates to the intentions of the heart. Jesus' approach is revolutionary. He shifts the focus from external action to inner attitude. Not so much what we do that counts, but who we are and why we do it. It's a call for a deep transformation of the heart, not just a change in behavior. Jesus begins by addressing the commandment, "You shall not murder." He says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Matthew 5:21-22. Here, Jesus doesn't just prohibit the act of murder, but goes to its root, anger and contempt towards others. He establishes a moral equivalence between murder and uncontrolled anger, contempt expressed towards others. This radical interpretation invites us to examine not only our actions but also our attitudes and words. How often have our hurtful words or our contempt killed someone's dignity or self-esteem? Jesus goes even further by saying that anyone who calls his brother a fool is in danger of the fire of hell. He uses hyperbole here, a deliberate exaggeration to emphasize his point. Our words have enormous power, and we are responsible for how we treat others, even in our speech. Practical application. The next time you feel angry with someone, take a moment to reflect. Where does this anger come from? How can you express it constructively rather than destructively? Try practicing the sacred pause, a moment of reflection and prayer before reacting in anger. Also consider the impact of your words. Before speaking, ask yourself, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? These 3 questions can help you communicate more respectfully and lovingly. Jesus continues with another striking example. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:27-28. Once again, Jesus goes beyond the outward act to address the attitude of the heart. It's not enough to abstain from the physical act of adultery. Jesus calls his disciples to cultivate purity of heart and gaze. This interpretation is particularly relevant in our modern culture saturated with sexualized images. Jesus calls us to a discipline of gaze and imagination, to treat each person with respect and dignity rather than as an object of desire. It's important to note that Jesus doesn't condemn sexual attraction itself, which is a natural part of our humanity. What he condemns is the objectifying gaze, which reduces the other to an object of personal gratification, rather than seeing them as a whole person, created in God's image. Practical application. Reflect on your media consumption. Are there contents that encourage an objectifying view of others? How can you cultivate a gaze that sees the dignity and intrinsic value of each person? Also consider your relationships. How can you cultivate a deep respect for the opposite sex, whether in your personal or professional relationships? How can you encourage a culture of mutual respect in your surroundings? Jesus then addresses the issue of divorce. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. Matthew 5:31-32. To understand the radical nature of this teaching, we must place it in its historical context. In Jesus' time, divorce was a male prerogative. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as trivial as a poorly cooked meal. Divorced women were often left without resources and socially marginalized. In this context, Jesus' teaching is a protection for the most vulnerable. It calls for taking the marriage commitment seriously and not breaking it lightly. By limiting the grounds for divorce, Jesus protects women against arbitrary rejection and affirms the value of marital fidelity. This teaching invites us to reflect on the value we place on our commitments, particularly in our closest relationships. How can we cultivate faithfulness and perseverance in our relationships, even when it's difficult? Practical application. In your relationships, whether romantic, familial, or friendly, how can you demonstrate faithful commitment? How can you work towards reconciliation and healing rather than abandonment when difficulties arise? Also reflect on how you can support marriages around you. How can you encourage and support couples going through difficult times? Jesus then addresses the issue of oaths. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. Matthew 5:33-34. In Jesus' time, oaths were commonly used to reinforce the truthfulness of a statement. But this had led to a culture where truth was relative. People were more inclined to tell the truth under oath than in ordinary conversation. Jesus goes further, calling his disciples to such integrity that their simple word is sufficient. This is not a legalistic prohibition of all oaths. Paul himself uses forms of oath in his letters, but a call for radical honesty in all our interactions. This teaching challenges us about our honesty and integrity in all our interactions. Are we people of our word, reliable in our commitments, without needing additional reinforcements or guarantees? Practical application. Reflect on your communication habits. Are you always honest, even in small things? How can you cultivate a reputation for integrity such that your simple yes or no is sufficient? Also, consider how you can encourage a culture of honesty and integrity in your professional or community environment. How can you be a model of integrity for others? Jesus continues with a revolutionary teaching on vengeance. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Matthew 5, verse 38 to 39. The law of retaliation, eye for eye, was originally designed to limit revenge, ensuring that punishment did not exceed the offense. But Jesus goes far beyond, calling his disciples to completely renounce vengeance. This teaching is one of Jesus' most radical and misunderstood. It's not an invitation to passivity in the face of injustice, but rather a call to break the cycle of violence and revenge. Jesus proposes a third way between violence and passivity, a non-violent resistance that affirms the dignity of the oppressed while refusing to dehumanize the oppressor. It's this approach that inspired social justice movements like those led by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The example of turning the other cheek is often misinterpreted. In the cultural context of the time, a slap on the right cheek, given with the back of the right hand, was a gesture of insult and degradation. By presenting the other cheek, the insulted person forces the aggressor to treat them as an equal. A slap with the palm on the left cheek, thus challenging the power dynamic without resorting to violence. Practical application. The next time you're faced with injustice or conflict, how can you respond in a way that refuses violence but also affirms your dignity and that of the other? How can you be an agent of reconciliation rather than perpetuating the cycle of revenge? Reflect on a situation in your life where you've been tempted to seek revenge. How could you have reacted differently in light of this teaching from Jesus? How could you apply this principle in your family, professional, or community relationships? Jesus concludes this section with his most radical teaching. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:43 to 44. It's important to note that the second part of the verse quoted by Jesus, hate your enemy, is found nowhere in the Old Testament. It was rather a common interpretation at the time, based on the idea that if one must love one's neighbor, one can hate those who are not considered neighbors. Jesus categorically rejects this interpretation. His call to love one's enemies is perhaps Jesus' most distinctive and difficult teaching. It goes against our natural instincts and the cultural norms that surround us. But this love for enemies is not a warm feeling. It's an active decision to seek the good of the other, even of the one who has harmed us. It's a reflection of God's own love, who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Matthew 5:45. Jesus calls us to imitate the perfection of God's love. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Matthew 5:48. This perfection is not an impossible moral perfection, but a maturity and fullness in love that makes no distinction between friend and enemy. Practical application. Is there someone in your life whom you consider an enemy? How could you take a step, even a small one, to show love towards this person? It could be as simple as praying for their well-being, or trying to understand their point of view. Reflect on how you could apply this principle of universal love in your community. How could you reach out to groups or individuals with whom you disagree? How could you promote understanding and reconciliation in conflict situations? In conclusion of this first part of the key teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus establishing an ethical standard that goes far beyond mere external observance of the law. He calls his disciples to a deep inner transformation that affects our attitudes, motivations, and relationships. These teachings are not simply rules to follow, but an invitation to a new way of living. They challenge us to see the world and others through God's eyes, Act with a compassion and integrity that reflect God's own character. Jesus calls us to a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. This superior righteousness is not about doing more good deeds or following more rules. It's about transformation of the heart. It's a righteousness that flows from love rather than fear, from compassion rather than legalism. These teachings of Jesus are radical and countercultural, as much today as they were 2,000 years ago. They challenge our attitudes towards anger, sexuality, marriage, honesty, revenge, and love. They call us to a life of inner discipline and sacrificial love that goes far beyond mere external conformity. Of course, living according to these principles is not easy. We will often fail. But that's precisely where God's grace comes into play. These teachings are not meant to condemn us, but to show us our constant need for God's grace and transforming power in our lives. The Sermon on the Mount is not a new set of impossible laws to follow, but a description of life in God's kingdom. It's a call to live now according to the values of this kingdom, to be salt of the earth and light of the world. As we conclude this video, I invite you to reflect. Which aspect of Jesus' teaching challenges you the most personally? Why? How could these teachings transform your relationships and daily interactions if you took them really seriously? Where do you need God's grace and power to live according to these principles? How could you start putting these teachings into practice in your daily life? Choose one concrete action you can take this week. Remember, the goal is not immediate perfection, but a process of continuous growth. Every little step counts. Each time we choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, integrity over deception, we take one more step on the path of the kingdom. In our next video, we'll continue exploring the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, focusing on prayer, fasting, and our attitude towards material possessions. We'll see how Jesus calls us to an authentic relationship with God, transforms all aspects of our lives. Until then, may the grace and peace of Him who gave us these transformative teachings be with you. May you be salt and light in the world, living in a way that reflects God's character and love. May your life be a living testimony to the transforming power of the gospel, bringing hope, love, and reconciliation to a world that desperately needs.